Hi there. In this video we're going to take a look at how Joomla works under the covers, and in particular we're going to look at whenever you navigate to a Joomla site like this one, which I've got just on my local host. What does Joomla have to do to present this HTML page back to you? In terms of further reading, there are a couple of references I've put down. This is the Joomla manual, which is in its early stages. There's a lot of stuff there, but it's just beginning. This also is a good source of documentation about Joomla extensions. And finally, you can step through the code with an IDE. Basically, that's how I found out about how Joomla actually works. I use Eclipse, and it's pretty necessary if you're thinking about doing extension work or developing a Joomla extension. These slides are going to be at this URL here, and I'll put this into the YouTube notes, so you're welcome to use those if you like. Okay, let's get started. First of all, I want to cover the types of context that you can run Joomla in. You'll be very familiar with browsing, using your browser to access the site. You're going onto the site index.php or onto the administrator/index.php, and when your browser issues that HTTP request, it will go to the server and will be handled by a bit of software called a web server, for example an Apache web server. It will look at the URL, see in this case you're wanting to run a PHP file, and because you want to run a PHP file, it will contact the PHP interpreter and basically tell it, go and interpret this file, either index.php or administrator.index.php, and then the output it will then send back to the client browser. As well as those two files, you can write your own PHP script. Not really supported all that well by the Joomla developers, but you can do it. You basically have to initialize Joomla in the way that we'll be looking at in a few slides' time. Also introduced in version 4 was the ability to have an API access into Joomla. So if you've got a client application, you can again use HTTP to contact the server, and the PHP server then will be directed to run this file api/index.php. And finally, there is, let me go back to that API access. You can find out about that on the web. This, for example, is something I found. You can do various operations, get banners, delete banners, all those sorts of things. Really an API access into Joomla. We're not really going to cover that here, and we're not really going to cover this next thing here, which is command line access. If you're on a terminal or within a cron job, you can run PHP directly without going through the web server and perform various operations. And again, you can find out more about that on the web. I just found this one here, and it lists the available commands that you've got to you by that mechanism. Okay, so what we're going to concentrate on in this video is really looking at going via the client browser to run the site index.php file, and what Joomla has to do to present back to you this page here. So there's really 4 steps here, and then a 5th that we'll cover later. The first step is the initialization. So Joomla has to do a lot of initialization. So it sets up some defines. If you've looked at Joomla code, it will check this JExec is set, and if not, it will exit, and that's to make sure that the code is going through this proper mechanism rather than the client coming through and trying to access one of the library modules, for example. It will also set up kind of constants which point to the various bits of the Joomla instance there. I've got this under J442, various directories, and that will be set up as well. It will set up autoloaders and the class loader. Now, if you look at the number of PHP files in a Joomla instance, it is huge. So there's no way that Joomla can kind of read and process all of those files in any sort of time frame to handle efficiently an HTTP request. So basically what it does is it uses auto-loading. So it will allow PHP to go through and execute a file, interpret a file, and if PHP doesn't know where a class can be found, it will then go to this autoloader which Joomla sets up here, and the idea is that Joomla uses standards for where a particular class should be found on the disk, and you can find out about that all around namespacing here, so you can find out details of how that works in that document there. But this enables Joomla to really interpret classes on an as-needs basis rather than trying to read everything all at the start, so it knows where all the classes are. Next, it sets up an exception handler. So if you have some sort of exception in your code and you don't handle it, basically your code will crash. And whenever your code will crash, you want to have some indication back to your client browser about what is the problem here. And Joomla really does that for you, and that if you have got a crash, it actually picks up the exception as kind of like a last gasp exception handler, and it will then find that exception, what the problem is. It will give you a back trace of what you've run in PHP. It will format it nicely for you and send it back to your client browser, all for you to help you understand where your problem lies. It'll register a shutdown function, and that's to do with the session. Let's look at first of all at what the session does. Whenever you're sending a request from a client to a server, you'll send that HTTP request. The server will then respond, and it will also add in cookies, and those cookies will be stored in your client browser, and whenever you send another HTTP request to the same domain, it has to be the same domain, it will send back the cookies that it previously sent. So this is used by the server to hold session data, because it can have that session cookie pointing to an item of session data. For example, the logged on user, so that whenever this next request comes through, it'll look at that session cookie and find, oh, this is the session data that was associated with that session. This is the logged on user, for example. So as it's processing the Joomla is going through, it's writing some key data items here, and when it shuts down, Joomla makes sure that that session data gets stored here, so that whenever the next cookie is received, it'll be able to recover all of that session data for you, and that's set up in this shutdown function. It reads the global configuration, which is this file here, configuration.php. It sets up the dependency injection container and inserts some key classes into it. Now, dependency injection was introduced in Joomla 4, and unfortunately for people coming on to Joomla for the first time, it can be very off-putting. A recommendation would maybe be to forget about it for a while and just use a standard services provider.php code. But if you want to go into it in more detail, there are details here about dependency injection and how to get it working and why it's there. As I say, it is rather off-putting at the start, but you know, it does provide benefits in making Joomla a lot more flexible. And whenever you get something out of the DIC, then it pulls through its dependencies. So the next thing it does is it gets the application class, which really is the main flow of control through Joomla. And it pulls that out of the container and draws in its dependencies. I think the database, for example. Continuing on with initialization, it will set up logging, so you can log messages to files and that sort of thing. It will get the logged on user again from the session data, and will set up any preferences as regards presentation or which editor, for example, it's the administrator, which editor that user prefers. It will get the language to use. Now the language can be defined in a number of ways. If we look at this site here, this is basically a clean install of Joomla 442, and it's set up with multiple languages, and you can see up here I'm selecting the English language in the URL. I could go through and set up here the French language and get the French equivalent. If you don't have it specifically set in the URL, then if you're a logged on user, it will use your user preferences. Or if you're not a logged on user, you come into a new site, you can set preferences into your own browser, your preferred language in your browser, and it will use that. Or failing that, excuse me, it will just use the default language of the site. And once it's got the language, it will load the library language files. So in here, it will go into language if it's on the site, and will load in libjoomla.ini. So these are all language constants which are set up. All the code then should refer to these language constants, and then whenever it is output, Joomla will convert that into the appropriate message for that language that the user is set up to use. And the Joomla library stuff is really just a kind of like a standard list that is used multiple times within Joomla. Just as an aside here, you will see sys.ini files, and just to explain what those are, whenever particularly you're in the administrator and you look at the language files there, you will see a lot of ini files there. For example, there's content sys.ini. And the reason for that is whenever you are in the administrator and you're kind of doing general sort of stuff, you've got these items here, these on the menus, and all of these are set in the language files. For these ones are for com content, these were for com files. So also whenever you're adding a menu item and you want to select that menu item, all of these things here are general items here. And the way that Joomla works is these are only needed for these sorts of operations here. So rather than having everything in the ini file, which is run whenever that particular component is run, anything that is available on a menu or a menu selection like this should go into the sys.ini files. So you can see here the sorts of things like articles and categories and featured, which were in the menu here. Okay, next thing is it handles a routing function. So if we look at the URL here, let's go back to the start in English. So this is the home page, and whenever I click on something like blog, you can see the top level URL there is of a form /en/blog, and that's because the system has been set up, the site has been set up to use SEF URLs, search engine friendly URLs, but really URLs which are sensible. And whenever we look at that on the main menu, we see this item, this menu item, and its blog is the title, and that's what it looks like here. But underneath, from an internal point of view, this is what that menu item is pointing to. So this is pointing to com content. It's saying this should be the component which is going to be used. It's going to use the category view, and it's going to use the blog layout, and ID 11 refers to the item of content that it's going to use. So the router needs to convert between this format here, /en/blog, into this internal sort of format to be able to work out which is the component which needs to be run here. What are the details that it needs in order to work out what should be presented back. So the key thing here is finding the item ID, and the item ID really is just the ID of that. Oops, sorry. ID of that menu item, but it's known as menu item in the as item ID in the code, and that will then tell us what component is going to be run, plus view layout details. It's also going to set up some input parameters, which are going to be those ones that we looked at before, these things here, option, view, layout, and you can find also about input in the details over here. Okay, so it's done the initialization. Next thing, it's going to get the document. So the next thing Joomla is going to do is going to create a document instance, and the document is really just a PHP class, so it's an object which represents what is going to get rendered as HTML, what is going to get sent back to the client browser. It can be a JSON feed if you're running an AJAX request, or can be a feed of XML. But in general, it's going to be an HTML document. And when it starts up, it specifies the character encoding, UTF-8, language, direction, that sort of thing. The next thing it's going to do is going to get the template and params from the active menu item, or override. So you can override the template. You can specify in here, you can specify an extra string question mark template equals, but if you don't do that, Joomla will find the template from this menu item here, and it will do that by going into, if we look at the system here, site templates, you'll see that here we've got the details pages, we've got the pages on which a particular template is used. Now I'm using Cassiopeia, and then I've got a child of Cassiopeia, which I'll talk about in a little minute. But basically you can define what pages are used by a particular template, and I've got this particular child template running on this blog page, which is why this blog page looks a bit different. Here. Whereas if I go home, it goes to the standard page. So basically what I want to explain is that the page, the web page identified by the menu item really defines how you're going to work, the template you're going to work with. So once you've got the template and the params, you can find the params basically from sorry, let's go back to the styles. See, these are the params associated with the template. So once you've got that, the next thing it'll do will be to get the web asset manager, components assets and templates assets. Now the web asset manager was again introduced in version 4, and it manages all of the CSS and JavaScript files. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about that, but you can find more information on it online or in this web asset manager document here. Let's take a look at the template in a bit more detail. So if we go to the templates here, we'll see that we've got Cassiopeia, which is the standard Joomla 4 site template. And if we look inside what we've got a number of files here. Index.php is the one which we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail. It is the one which really presents back this here. But just before we look at it, let's look at some of the others. Error.php is whenever you have an error and you want to get details of it presented back to you, this is what Joomla is going to use. Offline.php, again, if you set your site offline, this is what is going to be sent back. Template details.xml really defines the structure of your template, which is what we're going to look at now. The Joomla Cassiopeia template is really something I've really been very impressed with. This is the structure then of what is going to get sent back. And if we look at the index.php, we'll see that in a bit more detail. So it's outputting modules in the top bar, below top, menu, search. And if you look at this in pictorial form, you see this is what it looks like. So we have the top bar, below top, menu, search. And the particular nice thing about it is that this bit here is like a grid. So in this grid we've got it set up for a wide PC-like presentation. We've got a sidebar left and then a main area in which the component gets rendered, and the sidebar right for other modules. But if you're on a phone, for example, you can specify these to get presented differently. So you'll get this first and then sidebar left or sidebar right, or whatever way you want it set up. So it's easy to work with other types of devices and other sizes. All of these module positions, below top and top A and everything, are all flex boxes, so you can easily set those to be horizontal or vertical or whatever, and then whenever you go to a smaller device they fit nicely one on top of each other, whereas on a wider device they might be across. On a smaller device they'll go nicely into various rows. So very easy to work with to provide support for different types of devices. Okay, so that's the template. The next thing that Joomla will do is it will run the component. Remember the component we found from the menu item, and in running the component it will instantiate the extension and dispatcher classes of that component, which are really hooks in to run that component. Again, you can find out more about extension and dispatcher classes here. And then it analyzes a task parameter. Now a task parameter is really just one of the parameters which are set in the HTTP parameters. So this is a particular task, this is a particular parameter that is used by Joomla, and it basically is used to determine the controller type which is going to be run and the method within that controller. For example, if we look more at administrator and then we'll look at, say, components, content, and we'll go down to the various controllers. There's a number of controllers there, and depending on what this task parameter is set to, it will pick the controller type. If it's set to Ajax, for example, it will select Ajax controller, and then the second bit will be the method name that is used to run within that controller code. Joomla uses MVC plus a TMPL file, sometimes called a layout file or a template file for outputting HTML. And there's a picture of it here. You have the controller which really works out what do I do with this HTTP request. It gets the details of it in and decides this is how I'm going to handle it. If it's going to present back HTML, then it'll have a view file and a model file to get any data related items. The model can get stuff from the database, or if it's changing things, there are table classes which make the CRUD operations a lot more simple than working directly with the database. The view in particular is split into two. The view file really determines what data items it needs for that view, and the TMPL file really specifies the HTML and specifies how those data items are output in the HTML. So those are separated really from the point of view of flexibility, because it means that we can override this more easily. So when it runs the component, Joomla then captures the HTML. It captures the HTML that's output by the TMPL file and stores it in the document buffer. So it doesn't output it directly, it just stores it in the buffer. Then the next thing Joomla will do will render the document. So at this stage it will get the template file into memory. So it will do again an obstart get contents of this template index.php file. And it will process this file to get it into memory. And if you look at this file, you will see a lot of JDoc include statements, include metas, styles, scripts. So this is really like an HTML file with holes in it. These aren't standard HTML, all these include statements. So once it's got it into memory, it will process these JDoc include statements and will fill in these holes. So for example, that meta one up the top, it will fill in with metadata. The styles and scripts there, it will fill in with details obtained from the Web Asset Manager. The modules, then it will render those modules, so it will run each module and capture its HTML output. So for example, if we're looking at this one here, it will find all of the modules which have a position of top bar. It will run those modules, capture the HTML output of those modules, and then insert the HTML into this section here within this index.php file. The message area, it will get any enqueued messages from the site. And in the component then, it will copy from the component buffer into that area. And somewhere down here we should find the component. And there's the message one there. And you can see how that matches back to the overall structure of this. So this is the HTML file from that index.php, and it's been filling in all of these little holes here, the modules, the component, the messages, all those sorts of things. And then finally it will respond back with that data buffer. It will send those things back, and it will go back through the web server to the client browser. Okay, so we've been covering the various types of extension that Joomla supports, templates, components, modules, but we haven't said anything about plugins. And really we've skipped over a lot of stuff because this is really just an overview. We've skipped over about access, which is really what the user can see, permissions, what the user can do, otherwise known as ACL. And with access permissions, you're responsible for building these into your extension. It's a framework that's provided by Joomla, but you have to actually use that framework in your extension by calling the appropriate routines. Forms, Joomla makes it very easy to build forms, build HTML forms, adapt them, and makes it very quick to build them. Cache and plugins. So plugins is what we're going to look at next. So plugins are code outside the normal flow and triggered by events. So if we're following through the normal code progression down through Joomla, at various stages you will get import plugin and you will pass in a type, and that type will relate to a folder within the plugins folder. So if we look at plugins here, we've got lots of different folders here, and that is associated with the folder type. And whenever it imports those plugins, it looks for all of the plugins which are subdirectories of that type. So if we look, say, at behavior plugins, there are 3 there: compatibility, taggable, versionable. So when Joomla imports those plugins, it will run those plugins, and those plugins will register to receive notifications of events, and Joomla will store that in a local data store there. And then the second thing that will happen will be the dispatch event, and it will, when this is called, it will look at the listeners which are registered for that event, and then we'll call functions in those plugins. So this is a summary of what I've been saying. Plugins are grouped into types, which equates to folders of the plugins directory. I think primarily for performance, but also a little bit for security as well. Within the plugin then you register to get notified of specific events, and here is a web page that gives a lot of details about what plugin events there are. If you click on one of those, you'll get a more detailed breakdown of what parameters and what return values and where they are. And whenever you get notified, it will run the plugins method when that event is dispatched. So you specify which method you want to run when that particular event is triggered. As part of that plugin, you'll get past data relevant to that event, and often the plugin can modify that data. So for example, the data for a content plugin will include the content. You can actually modify that content, that article for example, and send it back. So plugins can be pretty powerful. Since version 4, they're used for CLI functions. That's this thing here, the command line here. And you can define your own events. This ability to change things, you've also got access to the Joomla code as well as code data structures here. You've got access to the database, you've got access to data that's passed over in the notification. Is pretty powerful because you can change things, and really you can seriously mess up your site if you do something wrong with the plugin. Okay, that's basically it. We've covered how Joomla gets that HTML document back, and this latter bit is describing plugins. But I just want to finish with 2 slides. This is kind of like my view of the PHP classes. So you've got a number of PHP classes, Joomla classes, which are singled and core classes: application, config, database. And what we've been describing here is mainly concerned with the application class and its flow of control and how it introduces other things like config and database and language. This really is the core of Joomla. As well as that, you've got a number of library classes, MVC, table, and all these sorts of things, which are sometimes called by the core classes, but are also made available to extensions. And if you have an extension here, you will often get your own instance of one of these library classes that you can adapt and change, override to your own use. Then Joomla has a number of extensions which come with the package, and you as an extension developer can then develop other extensions, components, modules, plugins, templates, and have access to these library classes in the same way as the Joomla extensions. So that's just a picture that I use of the different types of Joomla classes. It's just a personal view there. And finally, overriding Joomla, particularly with Joomla 4, Joomla is incredible for the amount of overriding that you can do and the customization that you can do. Templates we've looked at. I've set up a child template there for Cassiopeia, and all it does is change the colors there. But the advantage of the child template introduced in Joomla 4 is that you just specify the changes that you want to make. Previously you had to copy the whole template. Now with Joomla 4 you can just create a child. You can do your own CSS customization either on the main Cassiopeia template or on a child. The template details.xml file, which really details the the types of positions that you've got. Those are extensible, so you can add in more positions if you like, if you don't find there are enough there. Language strings, you can override all of those, so you get your own preferred text output. HTML output, the TMPL files, or in the layouts directory. These are all overridable via template overrides. HTML helper has also got snippets of HTML. You can override those through the HTML service registry entries. You can change those to have your own bits of HTML there. Forms you can extend or modify via plugins. Components, even some of these Joomla components, you can change via the DIC, the Dependency Injection Controller, which dependencies get loaded for a particular component. You can then change how the classes of content, for example, and what it uses to get really it working the way that you prefer. The only thing that I don't believe that you can override is some of this core stuff here. Okay, that's about it. Thanks very much for watching. Hopefully it's been of some use. Bye.